May I have your attention? I'm Jim Milligan, and I'm chairman of the board of directors of the Concord Historical Society. But we have a wonderful relationship with the New Hampshire Historical Society, and they help make this kind of thing happen, as well as the Walker Lectures. And if you're not taking advantage of the Walker Lectures, you're missing something. So I highly recommend, it's in the newspaper frequently, pay attention to that. They do a fantastic job over there as well. This evening, our speaker is Jim Spain. And I asked Jim, how does he want to be introduced? And he said, hey, I'm just one of the local guys here in Concord. I grew up in Fosterville, but I bet some people have been watching the Concord Monitor and seeing those articles in the Concord Monitor. And also, he's now been on Chronicle a couple of times, and another one's coming up. So we'll be watching for those. But Jim's here because he grew up in Concord, as I did actually. And he's going to just give us kind of an outline of some interesting things that Concord is known for and things that have happened here. And I suggest that you be thinking about asking him questions. So if you get some thought that comes through, be sure to say, hey, wait a minute, what about this? Or better yet, Jim, you told me such and such in that article, and I think it was really this way. There's an opportunity to speak to the guy. So please help me welcome Jim Spain.
Welcome everyone. Thank you very much for having me this evening. It's an honor and a privilege to share some local history with you. Jim, thank you for that introduction too. I do appreciate that. My family has been here a long time. We go back to 1850. Spain is not a Spanish name, it's an Irish name. Another story for another day. But my family arrived here in 1850. We've been here ever since. I never left. I grew up here, and my wife and I married in our early 20s. We have 4 grown children and 4 grandchildren too. So for the most part, we've stayed in this area. That being said, how many people in the audience are local, or you've been in a lot of, oh, I'm seeing a lot of people here. That's wonderful. There's so much history. And I did talk to some of you about your past and your history, and it's truly inspiring. With the column I write, I like to find stories, and I'll tell you, there's an endless supply of stories that can be written and published in the Concord Monitor each weekend. So thank you again for joining me tonight. My presentation, basically probably 40, 45 minutes. And at the end, I always take questions and we interact. So please feel very casual and carefree, and you can ask me anything you want to ask at the conclusion of the presentation. This presentation, I do many different presentations. This one is kind of interesting. It's inspired by our resources. And that sounds odd for a historian to be talking about resources, but here in Concord, we're located in the middle of everything, and in the earliest days when we settled, people looked at that. You know, we're halfway to Canada, halfway to Boston, halfway to Vermont, and halfway over to the coast. So it's a very unique geographic location, and that's allowed us to grow and to prosper quite well as we became established. Travel with me, if you will, back to the earliest days. When this place was settled, of course, we were part of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And people came up here and they settled. The rivers were the superhighways a couple of centuries ago. Certainly the Native Americans, the Pennacook, used the rivers for transportation. And when the first settlers arrived here in Concord, they too arrived by boat and they came up the rivers. What they found here in Concord, early Concord in the very beginning, they found fields along the river had been cleared. And they were somewhat bewildered. What's going on here? It was the Native Americans. It was their land. and they were prospering here too, and they'd lived here for countless years prior to us. So I respect that, and I honor that too when I speak about that culture. That being said, our settlers arrived, and we had these resources. And all these resources came together. So when I put this presentation together, there's about 32 pages in this, with photographs and some verbiage. But this presentation was inspired by our resources. So I've broken it down to our individual resources: water, timber, brick, granite, and iron. With these things, our industries were created, jobs, and with the jobs came population growth. I like to say water, timber, bricks, and mortar, but there was so much more, lest we forget our granite and iron ore. People don't realize, they think of granite and they think of the Concord coaches. They don't realize that we had a lot of other resources here in Concord that really, really helped us establish ourselves and provided for our ancestors. With the water, a nice early view of the Merrimack River here in Concord, pretty much what our ancestors saw when they were traveling. The first people to come up that river utilized the water for transportation, and of course for drinking and so on and so forth. But they also used the, here we go, some planting, used the fields for planting along the rivers. There were many, many trees along the rivers that were transplanted, actually by the family that built this building here, and they planted them along Main Street in Concord. These wild trees along the river that were planted numbered several hundred to 1,000 from the south end of Main Street to the north. We didn't have air conditioning in the earliest days, so they planted trees for shade in the winter. Unfortunately, elm trees, many of these trees were claimed by Dutch elm disease, and certainly what Dutch elm disease did not kill, the hurricane did in the conclusion of the 1930s. Ferries and bridges, very interesting. That's the original bridge over at Sewell's Falls, East Concord. A lot of you probably didn't know we had a covered bridge there. Of course, growing up, we all saw the Iron Bridge, and we knew the Iron Bridge, and certainly there's a modern bridge there now today. Now, interesting story, ferries and bridges. We didn't have bridges initially here in Concord. So our earliest settlers are here, and there's some people over there on the other side of the river, and there's other people on this side of the river, which was really the epicenter of establishing the town. So over on the heights that we see today, there wasn't much. They called it the Dark Plains. There were a lot of pine barrens, a lot of lightning strikes up there, and fires. They also called it Burglar's Island because they said the people that were probably a little less likely to be honest, or perhaps they might have been robbers or whatever might have you, they hid up there in the woods and they lived up there. So that was the heights. And then we had the civilized people on this side of the river. How do you get back and forth? Well, it wasn't long as the decades were passing that people realized, they said, there's good land over there. We could plant that land and we could prosper ourselves. So people started going over to the other side of the river, but there were no bridges. So there was a ferry. Local businessmen put up their money, they invested in a ferry. So the ferry was down off of our main street, and there was nothing else around. So they set up this ferry and they said, this is wonderful, we're making all kinds of money. Well, the pastor over here in the Old North Church, is where the Binney Meteor is now, he says, people don't seem to be attending my masses on Sunday. What can we do? So he went to the people down at the city hall, the mayor and all the town fathers, and he said, what can you do to help me? Well, the people are saying they're not going to church because the ferry's expensive. We're not going to spend money on a ferry if we're not working and making a profit, moving our crops back and forth across the river. So the town thought about it, and they talked to the person that was a proprietor that privately owned the ferry. And he said, well, I'll tell you what. We'll think about building a bridge. And this is what they did. So they built the first bridge. And they said, we'll let you cross the bridge on Sunday. We won't charge you a toll. Because the first bridge was a toll bridge. Similar looking like this, it was a covered bridge. That worked out quite well. But then the people going to church on Sunday over here at the church. They said, well, if you give us free passage on the bridge on Sunday, why can't you give us free passage every day? They went back to the town. The people were complaining. There's a lot of discussion. It was a real political point. So Concord said, we'll talk to the people that built the bridge that used to own the ferry. We'll see if we can buy the bridge. So the city of Concord purchased the bridge. And they said, you know what? You can have free passage every day. So you know what the name of that bridge became? Free Bridge. And the first bridge in Concord was Free Bridge. And that's how the name was established. It was a free bridge. You could pass all day long. Nobody that owned the bridge privately, they didn't own the ferries anymore, so they were allowed to pass over Free Bridge. Well, Free Bridge was a wonderful thing. People were excited. They're going to church like they should be. They turned around and they're prospering and they're going back and forth over the Free Bridge. The Free Bridge location would be basically Bridge Street. That's why we call it Bridge Street. Go down Main Street, take a left where the Ramada Inn, the Holiday Inn is. Take a left, go down that street. And I still call that Bridge Street. People are calling it Loudon Road now, the whole way up. But that was Bridge Street. And when you get to the Merrimack River, it was a little bit, not that exact spot, it was a little bit to the left when you're going over the river, more towards the arena. But that was where the first bridge was. Now, bridges are a wonderful thing. Covered bridges are beautiful. But the fact of the matter is, when you have a bridge and you live in New Hampshire, you have ice. You have something called freshets. And that's big chunks of ice in the spring, and they break up. And guess what they do to bridges? They take them out. So the Free Bridge was repeatedly destroyed, as well as other bridges that crossed the Merrimack River in this general area. And the town said, we own it, we're going to have to replace it. So they started replacing the bridge somewhat routinely. Every so many years, the bridges would get washed away. Thank you. Timber. Yes, I went around and took these pictures. Timber, I didn't put the addresses because I respect people's privacy, but I traveled around, took some pictures of some of the houses. So we talked about water, and we're talking about timber now. The earliest settlers here in Concord, when they arrived, the Pennacook Native Americans were still here in town, and they kind of stepped back away. They didn't know who these strange people were. So they were cautious. Well, the settlers realized that we're going to have to build garrisons, and these garrisons will shelter our people if there's an attack or something happens. So what ended up happening is we had many garrisons around Concord. They're all named in accordance with the person, the family that ran that garrison. So you might have a house here and several other houses. There'd be a garrison right out here, and people would run to the garrison if a musket was fired to summon them to be protected. So those were timber garrisons, standing up logs and quite safe and fortified. But they were timber, and there was a lot of old growth forests around here, and it was utilized. They built these houses. These are timber houses. Another one just up the street here, very historic house. And this house is down the south end of Concord. Actually, a very prominent Concord person built this. His last name was Kent, and he entertained a lot of dignitaries from around the world, actually. And there's a fellow you might know, Samuel Morse, got married there to a local girl from Concord in this neighborhood. So a lot of prominent people. I can almost picture the carriages pulling up and people disembarking and celebrating with all kinds of refreshments and vintage activities. Then we changed from timber. We started building brick houses. And people said, that's a great idea. Obviously, the Kimball Jenkins. I took that picture today. And a lot of brick walkways, you get the granite around it, brick house. The interesting thing is, we had to take bricks and buy them outside of this area and put them on a barge and run them up the Merrimack River, and that was getting very expensive. And people said, that's ridiculous. So some people were down by the river, not just the Merrimack, but the tributary rivers in Concord here, and they said, this is clay. What can we do with this clay? So they took the clay and they mixed it up and they fortified it and they created little molds the size of bricks, and they put the clay in these molds, scrape the top, and put it in a kiln. And we had a very, very prosperous business here in Concord down the south end. They made bricks, and they made bricks in Concord. It's fascinating because I go into some old houses and I still see the old markings of some of these bricks that were originally built when Concord originally settled. We're going back to the 1700s. It's quite fascinating. So we have brick houses showing up. Another nice brick house, which is just up the street. Beautiful house. And this house is also brick in the south end as you head down towards Bow. Though they painted it recently, it's a gorgeous house. I do miss seeing it in its original state. When I was young, it was a red brick house. This is an interesting picture from my collection. I have thousands of vintage photographs. That's the Bell School. It was the first school in the north end of Concord. And it's kind of interesting. If you just look up the street, it was on the corner of Church Street, right where the, well, today we're calling it, I think we're still calling it the St. Peter's Rectory, but in that location, North State and Church Street, right on the corner, that was the original school. The Bell School name was used there. That's a really old picture. It was also used where the construction is going on downtown, where Parker School ended up being. There were two Bell Schools there too. They used to call them Bell Schools because they were boasting that they could afford a nice bell on the top of the school, and they would summon the students to school like that. So when they called it Bell School, that's what it was, kind of a tribute to the bell that they were able to purchase. And of course, another well-known building that's vintage and very beautiful is our City Hall that we use today over on Green Street. But did you know that prior to that being City Hall was where our county court is right now, kind of across the street down the road from Cumberland Farms, sets up on a hill. On that building, when they built it, they had the City Hall there, they had a library there too, and they were holding court there too. It had multi-use. That building actually sits on a spot that was occupied prior to that by the Stickney Tavern, which was a really famous tavern during the stagecoach days. There was a sweeping, it starts across from Cumberland Farms, sweeping driveway went right up to the beautiful old tavern and went down the other side, kind of where the long brick bank building is, I call it the Stuart Nelson Plaza building. But that's another story for another day too, certainly. But City Hall was over there, and then we built this City Hall on Green Street. And we still use it today. It's in great shape, and it's made of brick. This is a wonderful building. This building is the Norris Bakery. Of course, if you go to theater and shows down the south end, it's the old Concord Theater. You might remember it by that name. Well, we all went and we saw movies. We had the Capitol Theater. We had the Concord Theater. The Concord Theater building in its original state, you'll notice at the top, see all the chimneys? Brick ovens. They're a bakery. That's all they did. To the left of this building, you have the stables where the horses were kept, and you had all the horse, you can see the horse and carriages, they were doing all the deliveries. What's interesting about this, the house to the left with the mansard roof, that was unfortunately just torn down, was the Norris Mansion. And the Norris Mansion was a very historic home. That's where the family that owned this bakery lived, right to the left. Kind of where the natural food store is and where all the development is going on right now. So the mansion was quite fascinating because a lot of VIPs and very important people from around the world even would meet there, and they would confer and they'd make plans. Very important about this bakery, Monday through Friday, they would turn around and bake their bread, but they were known for one thing, hardtack. They provided the Union troops from New Hampshire with hardtack. Now, the soldiers were quite pleased with the Norris family producing their food that they would consume on the battlefield during the Civil War, all the New Hampshire regiments, because some of the states provided food that wasn't quite good. And hardtack was commonly known as worm cake or worm bread, and because it wasn't really constructed or baked to that high quality, the Norris family prided themselves on. So they're baking, and the ovens are going around the clock. And here in Concord, we had all these Civil War soldiers. It was a big recruitment center right here in Concord. So what they did is they trained them here too, and the troops had to be fed. Saturday night, you're walking down Main Street in Concord, South Main Street, there's a pleasing aroma. They would stop doing the hardtack and all the other baked goods, and they would do gingerbread. Gingerbread was just so coveted. It was a treat, it was delicious, it smells good. Everybody loves gingerbread. So they turned around, and on the weekends they were producing this gingerbread. Well, the sutlers, those were people in wagons that would follow the troops around. Gettysburg, Vicksburg, all these battlegrounds. And they'd stay back. When the fighting's done, they'd pull up these merchants, independent merchants, and they would say, we have gingerbread, we have this, we have that, you need shoes, whatever. And they'd follow them around. Well, they always had gingerbread. The troops loved their gingerbread. It was affordable, it was a treat, it was something that they really looked forward to instead of the hardtack. New Hampshire troops, training. You had a lot of activity. Break a day, training up there. Interesting in this neighborhood, if you go up this street right here, the historic district, you see the Franklin Pierce House. Then there's some water. Across the water, there's more land. That was a training ground for Civil War soldiers right here in the historic district. Very interesting. Another thing, referring to this neighborhood, in Concord, with resources in mind, there are 3 huge bluffs. We have them across the street, don't we? Over there towards East Side Drive and over that area, we did have bluffs. Not as big as that, not as prominent. They call that the Sugar Bowl because it's cut out kind of like a semicircle. When you get on the highway and you're going up to the Heights or the old mall location, you can see the cutaway. Over here on this side of the river, we had 3 very, very large bluffs. And people don't realize that. They were really primitive. But what happened is they're all gone. The first bluff was down the south end, over the Water Street Bridge area. We had Butter's Tavern down there, Howard Johnson's. Now it's the Common Man area. One was there. The second one was halfway up Main Street. And the last bluff was where the Civil War soldiers trained, right up here behind the house that was moved there, Franklin Pierce Homestead. So you had these bluffs. You might say, where are the bluffs now? How could they disappear? Well, anytime something good happens, it's always something bad happens too, counter effect. The railroad came to town. When the railroad came to town, they had to lay a lot of tracks. And what do you need to do when you lay tracks? You have to have flat, level ground beneath you. And where do you find that? You take the bluffs. All of that sand and gravel and soil, it all went under our railroad tracks. And that's what happened in Concord. We lost our 3 hills. And as unfortunate as it was a part of our early history, and it's too bad they're gone, but it is what it is.
Jim, before you go,
yes.
The year of that photo by chance?
I don't, it was not marked. I've had that in my collection for many, many years. But I mean, you're talking during the Civil War period. Yeah. Photography didn't exist much before that. So, right. So it probably would be during that period and after, late 1800s. Yeah. I have beautiful pictures of Main Street. Main Street's one of my favorite areas to take a walk at night, to enjoy. You can really walk back in time when you walk down on Main Street. Main Street, we all know the width, we all know the different compilations, we all know that, sometimes we used to have 4 lanes and that was kind of dangerous with crosswalks. Now we have 2 lanes and our city councils are taking care of our safety, and we appreciate that. But the fact of the matter is the original plan for Main Street, I'm still in my brick mode, all brick buildings. The original Main Street called for it to be twice as wide. What ended up happening is they were going to put a park-like setting in the middle with trees, because they didn't do grass and that sort of stuff back then. But they were going to enclose the middle, have a park-like setting in the middle, and widen that up a little bit. What ended up happening is people were moving here, people wanted to build, they wanted to establish it further. The Main Street was certainly not paved, and with unpaved streets you have water in the spring, you have mud, you have all kinds of issues. So they built these wooden boardwalks in front of all the stores so you didn't get in the mud, and the ladies could lift their dresses and walk along the boardwalks, while the men walked in the streets. You had horses and carriages and wagons and all kinds of things. As time passed, Main Street was established closer than it was originally planned. We brought the horse trolley in. And the horse trolley is pictured there. They laid out 8 miles of track in Concord. The horse trolley, in time, made it all the way up to Pennacook, and it went down the south end. We used to have a wonderful Concord State Fair on Clinton Street, and people would travel from all over to come to that fair. And they come up on the train. They get off the train, and the Phoenix and Eagle hotels were really, really good about providing a free wagon ride if it was to their hotel. And they bring the passengers up, they'd stay in the hotel. Then they would go out to the street, they'd have dinner at the Eagle or the Phoenix Hotel. They go out to the street, and they get on the trolley, the horse-drawn trolley, and they'd go up to the fair. And they were coming from New York, they were coming from Boston, they were coming from all over. And the trolley was just an amazing development in the history of Concord. That was a horse-drawn trolley. Years later, of course, it became an electric trolley. And I have a wonderful picture of my great-great-uncle Steve Spain heading up towards Pennacook at the reins of a trolley. And it's quite fascinating, and that's what he did for employment. You'll also notice in this picture, very primitive electrical lines just starting to evolve. Gas lanterns. I wrote a wonderful story years ago, one of my favorites. There's a gentleman in the Civil War. He came back in the late 1800s, and he needed a job. He went down to the town. He said, "What can I do? Do you have any work?" They said, "Sure. You're a veteran. You're a pretty rugged guy." He became the lamplighter. And that's what he did. He would walk around each night and light every single lantern. The gas was produced in the brick chamber at the south end of Concord that we still see there today. Very historic. So that's quite fascinating. And to the right, you see the Phoenix and Eagle hotels there too. It's a wonderful picture. Another picture, Board of Trade building to the left. So that means that we're looking north. The Board of Trade building is over here. It had a clock tower. I think I hit the right building. It had a big clock. Some of you might know that building today. Heading down Main Street, it's on your right-hand side. It's Merrimack County Bank. And the Board of Trade building is quite fascinating. The Chamber of Commerce was there early on, as well as a lot of other businesses and nonprofits and some educational facilities. They built 2 stories, and then they kept going up, and they built the clock tower. At some point, somebody realized that we might have some structural issues. They took the top level off of that building. And with that top level, the clock tower disappeared. But today, in the shadow of the Merrimack County building, we're so blessed to have the clock and the bell back. It sits in that little housing at the entrance on Main Street. You've probably seen the glass enclosure. And it's just a wonderful thing to see it come back to Concord. Because at one point I heard we had lost track of it. We didn't know where it was. But it did come back, and we were very fortunate to return that to Main Street. So when you hear that chiming, at one time, a century before, your ancestors heard it chiming too, at the top of that trade building. Another Main Street view, more of a close-up of the Eagle and Phoenix hotels. One problem with timber buildings, and brick buildings too, fire. We had an issue. So the Phoenix suffered and was rebuilt. The Phoenix, the Eagle Hotel, you can see to the left there, still stands today. But there was, and I do have my another great uncle, Michael Spain. He was in a fire brigade, and he was in Concord. He was a volunteer. All they had was bucket brigades, and they would be summoned by the fire chief, and he would go out there and he would handle the buckets, and they tried to put the fires out. But there came a time where all these buildings in Main Street were suffering continually, and they were burning. There's a lot of fires. So at one point, after a number of fires, they started saying, listen, you've got to keep space between the buildings. We're losing too many buildings, and the fires are catching, and they're passing to the next building. So the city put together an ordinance, quite frankly, that there had to be space around these buildings. Another beautiful view, Main Street, southerly view. I like this picture too. Board of Trade building, a little closer there, you can see the clock, same clock that we have in Main Street today. State House is really sharp to the right where those trees are. A lot of trees down there. What I love about this is the street was no longer unpaved, it was cobbled. So the street was cobbled at this point. And you can see the tracks, but you don't see wires overhead. So those tracks are horse trolley tracks that were pulled by horses. So that's a really old photo. Gives you a nice picture of what it was like to walk around Main Street, Concord, heading in a southerly direction. A wonderful building. Nathaniel and Amelia White, two wonderful people. We had the White Opera House. That was a gift to the city of Concord, to the people living here in this community. White Park, another gift. Their house wasn't far from here, but they were wonderful people. Nathaniel White came to Concord with very little money. And by the time he passed away, he was probably one of the wealthiest men in New Hampshire. They supported people in every way and means. They were wonderful people. Nathaniel, when he came to town, worked in a hotel. Wasn't making much money, but he saw the coach coming in, and he started to understand he could make some money with freight. So this local man started basically the American Express Company. You can reach in your pockets and pull out American Express, and that's the origin of that company that Nathaniel White started. So he and his wife were wonderful to the community. We have the White Farm out on Clinton Street, and they were part of the Underground Railroad, ushering people that were enslaved in the South to Canada and seeing them safely along their way. I can't say enough about the White family, just wonderful people. Again, that would be a new show on its own, but their accomplishments, their generosity, you can't even measure it here in Concord. Now this White Opera House is just beautiful. People were coming from all over to perform. There's magicians and there's all kinds of things were going on.
What corner is that?
If you're looking at the State House to the right, if you're standing across the street, yeah. Unfortunately, the building burned down. And it doesn't exist today. It's gone. So.
It's a crime.
Oh, it really is. It's a shame. This is an interesting picture. This is Railroad Square. Railroad Square is basically the Capitol Shopping Center on Storrs Street. There wasn't a Storrs Street. Storrs was an architect. He built and designed bridges and other things here in Concord, and Storrs Street was named after him. Railroad Square is interesting. This is such a grand railroad depot, and to this day, I still hear stories. The building was torn down many years ago, 1960, I believe it was. It was torn down. The roof was copper, lots of brick. It was the third depot on that site. The original depot that was built there, basically, Concord coaches would pull up and pick up passengers and deliver them there. But this is a railroad depot. What's interesting about this building is it was so grand. And Boston and Maine Railroad were the last owners of the building. And unfortunately, as the railroad fell out of popularity and people started flying and using other means of transportation, a lot of these grand buildings around the country lost their luster, and the railroad did not want to be paying taxes on these buildings. It's very unfortunate that a decision was made to allow this building to be torn down. Interesting story. This is the third building. So my great-grandfather, Martin Spain, owned a quarry up in Rattlesnake Hill. And one of the jobs he had was to lay the foundation for this building. So they went down there in the late 1800s, and they're digging, and they're down probably several feet. And they're getting ready to drop that massive pieces of granite into the ground. And there's a fellow digging, one of the laborers, and he said, there's something down there in the hole. Well, what is it? So they all jumped in the hole and they pull it out. There's a sword. Several feet below the surface in Concord, New Hampshire, not far from the river. Quite fascinating. Stories of Vikings, Hibernians. We don't know the origin, but the sword was recovered, and local historians documented its age. It was really old and very historic. But doesn't it make you wonder who came 500 years ago? Who was in Concord? Who visited us? We like to think that our ancestors were the first settlers, but in fact, I think people probably were here many years before. But it's a story we'll never know the answer to. But that sword was found there. And what's really interesting is, I went down when they were just building a year ago, the new restaurant that's there. They're developing the whole parking lot by the market basket and everything. And I went down there when they were excavating, and I'm standing in the back holes pulling up the old granite foundation that my great-great-grandfather was involved with in laying when they found the sword. So it's kind of cool how history repeats itself. And it's very interesting, when they tore this building down, they buried so much under the surface of the ground to create the Capitol Shopping Plaza back around 1960, 61. People are excited about that. This building, I'm old enough to have talked to a couple of gentlemen that were on the demolition crew when this building was torn down. That roof's all copper. Yeah, that copper was reclaimed and salvaged and for scrap and sent outside of the country. Those workmen that I spoke to when I was a child told me there wasn't a dry eye on the demolition crew. They were so sad to be tearing that building down. And again, it echoes today, to this very day, here in this room. Granite industry, my family arrives in 1850. We've got to find employment. There's 4 Spain brothers. They came to Concord from Ireland. A lot of Irish up the street here in Fosterville, by the park, just up past the bowling alley. A lot of the early Irishmen that arrived here prior to 1850 found that they could purchase an old building and rent a room to the other Irish immigrants that are coming over here. Because there was a sudden influx, not just Ireland, a lot of countries, but they were all after the same thing: employment, security, and wealth. They got their jobs, they went up Rattlesnake Hill, which is behind Blossom Hill Cemetery. And there were dozens of quarries. But the quarry story doesn't start there. It starts with a gentleman named Luther Roby. Luther Roby was a Bible salesman here in Concord, mid-1800s. He would pay a fee and get permission to even reprint in his little press different farmers' almanacs and that sort of stuff. But he always loved printing his Bibles. He took these Bibles and he put them on his carriage, and he would go out to the surrounding communities and the farms, and I'll pass up Pennacook Street, I'll pass Long Pond, and he'd go to the homesteads and to the farms, and he would say, would you like to buy a Bible? Or perhaps we can forecast the planting season next year with this farmer's almanac. And that's what Luther did. And he did quite well for himself. He made a living, had a little press here in town. But one thing Luther noticed, and it inspired him: as you go up the south side of Rattlesnake Hill, present-day Pennacook Street, there's a lot of boulders on that side. But when you go by the north side, go up to Pennacook, take a left, the other side of Long Pond, there's not too many boulders. Some of these boulders, they're all granite, of course. Granite. They were huge. They were the size of houses. And Luther Roby kept looking at these as he traveled past on his carriage with his horse in front of him by himself, selling his Bibles. And he started thinking about it. Why are there so many boulders? Obviously, today we know it's geologic formation, and it's what happened, and perhaps when the glaciers passed over, they just trimmed off the top and everything fell on this side of Rattlesnake Hill instead of the other side. Regardless, Luther developed a plan. He said, perhaps I wouldn't have to sell too many Bibles if I could just take and somehow take these huge granite boulders on the ground, surface boulders, and cut them into blocks and sell them. People could build with them. They could do all kinds of things with them. But that takes a lot of labor, cutting granite. So Luther took a ride in his carriage up the street one day, and he said to the state prison warden, he said, can I hire the prisoners to perhaps cut granite for me? And he said, yeah, you can do that. So it was the old state prison. So Luther Roby employed the prisoners to cut the granite in 1850. He was the only one doing it. It wasn't many years later when there were so many people on that hill. There was 1,000 men a day walking up Rattlesnake Hill to work in the quarries. And amongst that 1,000 were my great-great-grandfather and his 3 brothers. And they went up the hill every day, and they lived with an Irish immigrant friend of theirs in Fosterville. They rented a room. And when they saved enough money, they sent back and married an Irish woman from their childhood and overseas. The Irish are very stubborn people. They would only marry Irish women. And because of that, I have many grandmothers before me in Concord with wonderful Irish names, Mary Ellen Cooley, Bridget Madden, and so on and so forth. And that's my paternal side of the family, the Spain side. So they're all up there on the hill working, and they're prospering. And Luther Roby was the one person that triggered the development of the granite industry. It's quite fascinating. So you would think that Concord would have nothing but granite houses, but I'll show you some more pictures too later. But granite was viewed as an investment. So when the granite was cut, it was brought down the hill. Here we are cutting. Granite would cleave like a piece of hard cheese. You drill a hole, you split it, and it cleaves quite nicely. So they would do that. And that's Rattlesnake Hill, some of the early quarrymen. The next picture. And what they did is they used it locally to a certain degree, but not that much. They built the state prison, and they built the warden's house, and only a couple of the houses. And they built steps, and they built curbings with that granite. That building used to sit, it burned down, that building used to sit to the left of Waters Funeral Home on South Main Street. The only thing that remains today is the steps, the granite steps that were originally put there. And the granite came from Rattlesnake Hill, of course. The steps lead to nowhere. But the building's kind of famous because after Franklin Pierce was president, he came back to Concord, a lot of heartache and death in the family. He ended up by himself. And he rented this building. On the day he died, he was upstairs to the right in his bed, his very last day. And there's an Irish woman. She was his maid and his servant. She helped him. And he knew he was going to pass Franklin Pierce. And he called out to her. He said, please, please, come here, hold my hand. I don't want to pass alone. And then he did pass. And that was the final day that Franklin Pierce lived. And of course, he's buried over here in the Old North Cemetery. And being Irish, it's very heartfelt to tell that story. And it's quite fascinating that we have an Irish maid or Irish washwoman holding the hand of a president of the United States. Quite fascinating, but true story. And the building burned, I believe it was in the 1980s. When I was a child growing up in Concord, that building existed. That building was purchased by Waters Funeral Home, an old friend of mine, Jack Clarity, and Jack owned that building. And inside that building, when Jack owned it, was still remnants of President Franklin Pierce. And unfortunately, it burned to the ground and everything was lost, except for the granite steps. The granite, we're back up on North State Street. You saw that wagon coming down the hill for Rattlesnake Hill. What do you do when the granite comes down? Big pieces of granite. We've got horse and oxen pulling it down the hill in a wagon. In the winter, we created sleds, and we were still pulling it down through the woods. The city of Concord wanted to see more quarries. We've got 1,000 men a day working up on Rattlesnake Hill. How can we get 2,000 men a day up there? So they went, the city of Concord took a vote, and the councilors passed an ordinance that provided funds in their budget to build roads up on Rattlesnake Hill. And those roads exist today. They're called spur roads. And they were called that because they were thought to spur new business, new quarries. My great-great-grandfather, he saw everybody else opening a quarry. So Marty turns around and he says to his wife, he says, you know what, my grandmother, I'm going to go up there and stake my claim. He walked up the spur road. He got just past Perry's Quarry that we used to swim in as children. And there's power lines there today, but there's a quarry right there. It's a dry quarry. It didn't fill in with water. And that's Spain Quarry. And that's my great-grandfather's quarry, where he worked most of his life and extracted the granite. But the granite would come down the street to Fosterville, basically, and they would bring it to these sheds. And these were, we call them stone sheds, granite sheds. They were brought there to be processed. So all the granite is up on Rattlesnake Hill. It's easy. You cut the granite, you're coming downhill with a full load. The most important thing in those wagons and those sleds were the braking systems. That's dangerous. They'd get it down the hill, they'd go to the stone sheds. These stone sheds, if you're standing, you know where the archway is at Calvary Cemetery? When you're going up North State Street, the big archway, Calvary was the Catholic section of the cemetery. It's the furthest northern point of the cemetery before you come to the state prison. There's a smokestack out there, and there's a development where they offer classes and lots of activities. Just south of that, that was all the stone sheds. As far as you could see, you had them all lined up. And they put the stone sheds there for a reason. Early on, before the railroad really took off, they would cut the stone into manageable pieces, ship it all over the country. A lot of famous buildings were built with Concord granite. They'd ship it and put it on basically barges, and they would load them on the Merrimack River, and they'd float it down the river, down to Haverhill, Lowell, and out to the ocean even. And the granite would arrive at its destination. But it wasn't very long before the railroad came, and the railroad got really established, and those railroad tracks to this present day lead right up to those stone sheds. They go right by them. And my dad actually grew up right in front of the railroad tracks on North State Street. Those are the stone sheds. A lot of immigrants, a lot of people just coming to the country trying to make a living. Got a next one here. And that's the inside of the a wonderful picture. I just got this recently. It's an interior view of the Perry stone shed here in Concord. We all know the Perry name. They make granite monuments. They make stones that we see all over the cemetery. Well, that's the inside, very, very early view. And you can see how they're developing and fine-tuning, and they're cutting all kinds of granite. And again, they used it for everything from steps to curbing, and they also used crushed stone for bases and foundations. And a lot of your older houses, if you've been in them around Concord, my first house by White's Park, all the granite in the basement was basically the foundation. So these old houses in Concord that were built, what they would do is they would come up, and you might wonder, there are no real big cranes or anything to move these massive pieces of granite. What they would do is they would cut, if you're going to build a house here, they would go in and hand shovel, and it would kind of just gradually come down and then gradually go up. Then they would come in with the horse and wagons, and they would unload these large foundation pieces of granite, and they'd set them on that flat area. Then they would take that crew, and they'd come back, and they would backfill. And then you have your level ground, your granite foundation, then they would build your house. Talented granite stonemasons. That's my grandfather. My mother's father. I had my Spain family here in Concord, all quarrymen, and my grandfather, who apparently voted for Al Smith, came over here from County Kerry, Ireland. And he arrived in Concord, met my grandmother, had my mother. They lived over here on Walker Street. My mother was actually born over here by Walker Street. And he was doing very well for himself. He did finished gravestones. I have a collection of photographs where he's standing at Blossom Hill Cemetery leaning against the gravestone that he just finished. And I could see the work he did, and it means a lot to me. This picture is one that you won't see anywhere because this is the old New Hampshire State Prison. This was located between Beacon and Tremont Streets. Now, the building that's there today is brick. The brick is the back portion of the building. The front portion of the building, the New Hampshire State Prison, the old prison, was all granite. Remember what I said? The prisoners were cutting the granite? Well, guess what? They built their own prison. And in that prison, too, they had men and they had women. And there's a lot of interesting stories about some of the early prisoners and why they built them and what they did. And it's just fascinating. The prison history, as we talked about, is quite fascinating. Granite, of course, our State House. Look at those elm trees. That's our State House down on Main Street. Quite fascinating. And look at the wrought iron fence in front and the people walking about. Yeah. Another granite building is our State Library, right behind the State House. And this is the cemetery, the Old North Cemetery. And there's granite mausoleums. A lot of your early gravestones prior to 1850, now this is the first cemetery, one of the oldest in the state of New Hampshire. These stones are slate, a lot of slate stones. A lot of people were craftsmen, and they would create these beautiful carvings on these slate gravestones. You didn't see the granite until, again, the mid-1800s and after, and they started building or manufacturing gravestones at that point of granite. But because of that, you saw a lot of marble and you see a lot of slate. And then you see the Stickney Mausoleum in the background, which is another story in itself. One of the granite, Spring Street, another granite building, just a small little plain house, a simple house, but a house it is, and it's granite. There was a story written probably about 1920s, and someone had asked the Concord Monitor, they said, why are there only 3 granite houses in Concord? And I ride around and I look for them all the time, but it's actually a fact. Granite was just so revered. It was so important to sell it and make money that they really didn't keep the granite. They did the prison, of course, because the prisoners cut the blocks. But this is a granite house with a mansard roof on Spring Street, that next one here. And this is another granite house. That house is on Tremont Street, very well preserved. The people that own the house do a wonderful job taking care of it. Now that house there, it's kind of interesting. It is, in fact, granite, but that house is at the bottom of Tremont Street. That was the warden's house for that state prison I just showed you, and that's where he was. The guards were said to have lived there at one time. The warden was said to have lived there at one time, but that house is at the bottom of Tremont Street, and it's a granite house from Rattlesnake Hill. I'm going to switch gears a little bit and get away from the granite, and I'm going to get to iron. So here we are. We have Ironworks Road. It says so on the monument. I'm a child, I'm growing up, riding my bike. I always saw this monument, and I didn't know the history behind it until I started researching it. This is a fascinating history. You've got Ironworks Road, okay. We had ironworks out there, which basically are kilns. Somebody discovered down on the river where they found that clay to make those bricks, they found iron ore, that red clay. They said, I wonder if we smelted that in kilns, we could make iron. So they said, let's try it. Well, they built a small kiln, they tested it, and they found out they had some great iron. And everybody needs pots and pans and all kinds of stuff made out of iron. So this is the 1700s, back during the colonial period in Concord. They built a larger kiln and a bigger kiln, and investors jumped in, and it became a business. And they had the big wagon, and they go down the river, and the guys would shovel the iron ore from the shore of the river. And they'd fill the wagon, and they'd bring it up to Ironworks Road, and they would take that iron, they'd smelt it, they'd make all kinds of wonderful iron implements, things for the kitchen, all kinds of stuff. You gotta remember, we're back in the 1700s here. People in Concord didn't believe we were gonna go to war with England and declare our independence. They were quite fascinated with the iron ore, but they said, well, that's good, make things for the house, that's wonderful. Until one day, a wagon arrived in Concord, and it had people in red coats. They were British soldiers that had been captured. And they were shackled, and they were sitting prominently in the wagon, and they were brought up across the highway from Portsmouth to Concord to stand trial. And they brought them right up Main Street so everybody could see them. And people are like, this is unbelievable. Maybe we really are going to go to war. You got to remember, we were a lot of Englishmen walking around Concord back then. They didn't believe it, but certainly. So these people were brought to Concord, and they went out to the community, and they said, we need some people in the jury. And nobody wanted to be in the jury. We don't know what's going on. Are they the enemy? Are they not the enemy? Who are these people in red uniforms? I mean, what's going on? We're subjects of the crown. We could get in trouble, or even worse, probably hanged. So they didn't want to do that. So the local authorities did decide that they were going to take and have a trial, and they selected residents from the community, and they sat down, they had a trial. And these red coats were brought in their uniforms and their chains, and they're standing in the courtroom. And the judge says, okay, well, you are guilty. Okay. I'll tell you what, the people in Concord, good people. We're not violent people. What we'll do is, if you promise us that you won't fight against us, ever pick up a gun and fight against us, we'll let you go. Take your uniforms, burn them. but you got to stay in Concord. And when you stay in Concord, you have to live here and you can get jobs. Just don't leave. These British soldiers assimilated into our community. And that's how we punished them. And you can't go home, you can't leave, you stay here. And you have to, of course, not bear arms against us. Well, these soldiers sent a message to the people in Concord because decades before, the Kerrigan House, big yellow house, which I think is white across from the old Friendlies, that's where the British soldiers were recruiting, and they were living there. The house was full of British soldiers. We were part of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. We answered to England. People are upset, a lot of taxation. People in Concord were not drinking tea anymore. They were switching to coffee or taking herbs out of their garden and making their own tea. But they were fed up with the taxes. So we're heading into the Revolutionary War period. We turn around, and we got this iron thing. And people are saying, what can we do with that? Well, I'll tell you what we can do. The investors said, let's grab some iron ore and let's start forming other things other than pots and pans. Let's make cannonballs. So down on Ironworks Road, they mass-produced cannonballs. And they contacted the Continental Army and George Washington, and they said, just want to let you know, the New Hampshire Volunteers, we've got all kinds of cannonballs. We're making them left and right. We're getting the iron ore out of the river. We're bringing it up to Ironworks Road here, putting it in the kiln. We've got all these cannonballs. They loaded the Continental Army for the Battle of Bunker Hill. They loaded those cannonballs. And our soil along the rivers defended our great nation when we fought at Bunker Hill. So it's quite fascinating. My last slide. Our future is our legacy. That's a picture I took last fall at the apple orchard, Carter Hill. Beautiful place. The stories that we tell today are stories that are probably going to be retold time and again. 100 years from now, it'll be very fascinating to see what stories are told about us and what we're doing and how we're preserving history. But history is just a fascinating subject. I really enjoy it. I think all of you must enjoy it too, I hope. And I hope you've enjoyed the presentation tonight. This has been a pleasure for me. I think that's my very last slide. Do I have one behind it?
Sort of.
Kind of. There we go. That's what I was looking for. Thank you very much. You're very kind. Questions, comments, discussions, and thank you. Anyone have any comments? Yes?
When did the plains turn into the heights?
Well, when I was a child growing up, and my dad was growing up from the 1930s and after, they were still calling it the Heights. So I believe the Plains or Burglar's Island is more of an 1800s thing. We had all these little pockets around Concord and all these old names. My dad used to tell me about it when I was a child many years ago. And he's the one that told me originally about the different names up there in the Heights. If you went up North State Street, you know where Concord Electric is across from the prison? That was a pine barren up there, but they called it Paradise because people would go there and picnic on weekends. They would go up to Long Pond by wagon. All the hills by Long Pond were cleared, and they would sit there and have their picnics there too. And there was cottages surrounding Long Pond at that time. They allowed boating and fishing too. So the Heights, Long Pond, the beautiful place called Paradise, it was all interesting. All those names are long lost, and people don't remember them anymore, and they don't even know about them unless they research. I don't have a date when that started, but I would suspect late 1800s. They started changing that over. Some of the names in the Heights remain. Break a Day. There's actually a country store called Break a Day up there in that area where we trained our troops. The first settlers of Concord called that Break a Day all the way out Loudon Road because it was the first spot in Concord where the sun would rise. You could see it there first. Break o' Day. So that's how that name evolved. A lot of the original names are quite interesting. There's reasons why we have those names. Another question?
You know what the oldest surviving house in Concord is?
The oldest surviving house, I'm not gonna tell you because I really do you know?
No, I don't.
Okay.
There's some controversy.
Oh, there is, of course.
Yep.
That's always a controversy.
there's a lot of controversy about it. But if you walk around Concord, one way to view that, the inner city streets are the original streets. If you go down South Main Street and you see some of the streets that branch off to the right, those streets were named after the farmers that had big farms, large farms down there. You know, Downing Street, for example. Some of those little brick houses down that way, I bet would be some of the original houses in Concord. Anything that branched off of Main Street, because the inner city was settled first. And then some of the outer areas were too. But I do a lot of volunteerism with cemeteries. I'm involved in several groups about gravestone preservation and cemeteries. And it's always fascinating for me to visit an old farm that's way outside of Concord and find that we have a family gravestone there, or a graveyard. Another question? What a great audience. They're making this easy for me. Thank you, guys. Have a good night. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed it.
Jim, that was fantastic.
Thank you. I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Folks, the second Thursday's coming up again next month.
Whoa, where is it?
And we have a plan. Next month is going to be about page belting.
Oh, great.
Anybody here work at page belting? There we go.
Grandfather.
That's wonderful.
Yeah, you had a family page, right? Yes. So we'll see you the 10th or July, I guess.
Is it the 10th?
I think it's the 10th. And thank you for coming. Hope you enjoyed it.
Thank you, everybody. Appreciate it.